Welcome back, and in this lesson we are going to be focusing quite a bit on JavaScript coding in order to build out our elements on the page. So this sometimes happens when you've got dynamic elements and you find that things, although they're working when we're initially testing it, when we add in a new function, things don't work anymore. So we see that we've got the false, true, 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 so everything is working. But when I add a new element, we lose our checkboxes. And when I output the data JSON, we see that we've got a problem here because we've got these are still checked off in the instance of the data, but they're not checked off visibly for the user. So very problematic, but I do have a solution, and there is going to be quite a bit of adjustments to the code that we've been working on. And if you don't need to add new tasks, then you're fine to go with what we have because it does illustrate how you can output JSON data. But in this case, we need to really tweak what we're doing with our data that's coming in. So first of all, let's create a brand new function. And what this function is going to be doing is it's going to add checkboxes. And there's also a thing whenever you're coding that you want to make sure that you're not doing things over and over again, the same thing. So over here, we're adding to the task list. Over here, we're adding to the task list. We're adding events down here. So over here, we're adding in a different way. We'd have to add events again, so on, so on. So not ideal. So we want to keep code dry, so doing it once and really fine-tuning our code. So this is going to really help. This lesson is going to be really helpful, and again, it's going to be really fine-tuned and focused on JavaScript. So we're passing some parameters that we're using to build that inner HTML. We're passing data, we're passing key. And there's another thing that I just wanted to point out before we continue, that if you go over here and if you inspect them, we see that we don't actually have that checked off. So even when we load it and if we check things off, we're not actually seeing anything checked within the elements. So that's where we get that problematic where it's just grabbing that HTML and re-adding content, and that's where our checkboxes are disappearing. So of course, a few different bugs there, and of course, we'll work through those. So that's so instead of adding this inner HTML, all we're going to do is we're going to pass the data and the key over to this function. And that's going to take care of the rest. And this function designed to be more versatile than the code that we have already. So we do have a data, we do have key. So the data is actually going to be here is going to be data key. So we're just going to be passing it like this. So it's going to be very similar, the information that we're passing. Comment this part out here. And so over here, what we're doing is, and we still need to include that, adding it into the data JSON object. So we need to keep that push in there. The only thing that we're updating is how we're building out that inner HTML. And the only thing that was really different was that instead of a key, we're just passing over the length, and we don't have a key for it. So we're just passing over the data. So we're taking in the data from the new element that has been added, and we know that the information that we're picking up when we're adding that new item, so that is information that we're picking up over here. So we're getting this value and we're getting the status, and we're adding that new item over here. So we could just as easily bring it out of that function because we don't have a lot of lines in this function anymore. Let's clear out some of this. So there's a number of ways to do it, but we'll just keep it as separate functions that have their own tasks to do. And that's usually the best way to go with JavaScript, that keep your functions to accomplish certain tasks. So now that we've really simplified what we're doing, we need to make this function work. So first of all, we know that we need to have a list item. So documents, and JavaScript has create element. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to create a list item and add it into that unordered list. So that's the first thing that we need. The next thing that we need to create another variable, and we need a checkbox. So same idea, where we create an element, and this time we're creating a checkbox, or we're creating an input. and we're going to transform that input into a checkbox. So now that we've got both of those ready to go, so they're both create elements, so we created these objects, they're blank objects, they're not sitting anywhere on our DOM, and now let's make some updates. So checkbox, first we need to turn it into a checkbox, because remember we just created a type of input, so we need to create a checkbox. So let's go ahead and create that. So that's going to turn that input into a checkbox. So essentially what we're doing is we're simply adding in those same parameters. So we've created an input, we've created a checkbox, we also need to create a value for it. So because we've created this object that is an input, we have the ability to adjust all of these just as we would within the DOM. So the value is going to be the key, because remember we're passing a numeric value in there, so we know where it's placed within the array essentially. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to add in so checkbox, and this time let's add in the checked. That should be a dot, because it's another object, and this time we know that we've got it under data status. Now, this time, we need to add into the list item. So that's the other object that we created. So we need to append child. So that's going to add in the checkbox as a child in that list item. And then lastly, we need to add that list item into our, so we're using query selector. And we need to select our task list. So we grab that element and we're appending a child again in there, and this time we're adding that list item that we created. So now we've done all of that. Let's go back out, refresh the page, and we see that we've created this. A few things are missing. Let's take a look at our code. So we've got the checkbox, we've got the values, so that's all right. Some text for it. We could do a label if we wanted, but let's actually do it as a check. As a node, so within the list item, append child. So we're appending a child, but this time we're going to do some text, or we could do it like this. We could do variable text inside, and from here we do same thing that we did before. So document, and this is a little bit different. So it's not create element. We're creating a text node, because we simply just want to have some text, and then within here is the data info. And this again we've passed into the data object there. So copying that in, so we need to append that text information. Let's go back out into our browser, take a look at that, just to make sure that everything is working properly, and that it is. Let's update our data as well, so we'll add in some that are true. So these are going to be checked off as soon as it loads. So everything is working. We don't have our events listeners added in yet. And we can also do that here within the same as we're building this out. So that's the kind of neat thing about it, is because we can save ourselves the function of adding events. So we don't have to do that anymore. We can comment that out, or we could remove that as needed. Add it in up here as an attribute. So let's go back into checkbox. So we're adding it into checkbox. So as we're building it out, this is where we can take advantage of doing all of the really cool things that we want to do. So add in on change. And basically what this is just gonna write that information out. So let me show you what happens. So we saw that we don't have them yet, and now whenever I add them in, we can go into the elements and we can see that now on change, it's updating JSON. So let's add in a console log so we can actually see something happening, and I'll move this underneath the key. Because right now what it's doing is it's adding it into the object, so we're not actually seeing anything happening. So now when I check it off, I get the numbers, test, and we can see that I'm checking it off. So everything is hooked up. So everything is working. And now all we need to do is add the final part. So we've got all of this updated, and now all we have to do is just essentially clean up our code. So let's do that. So we've got our build checkboxes, so that's going to be really cleaned up. We don't need to have this add events anymore, so let's can get rid of that. Get rid of this one as well. And so it looks like that's good and ready to go. So let's give that one more run. Just make sure everything is working properly. And then, of course, we've got some other tweaks that we're still going to be adding in. So test, test, and let's see what our data JSON object looks like. So we do have all 6 listed in there. And let's double check. So the first one's false, true, 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 false, true. So I know this exercise, this lesson was a little bit more complex. We had to dive into JavaScript, creating elements within JavaScript. And this is actually the proper way to create those elements. Before, what we were doing is we were updating the inner HTML, which works for the most part. But in some cases, like the case right now, it didn't work exactly as we needed it to work. So that's why we had to call and do a little bit of tweaking and updating. So now it's up to you. So update your code and add in a brand new function that's going to handle the creating of the checkboxes. So it handles the creating of the checkboxes as we loop through all of the existing keys. And then if we add new values, it's going to also use the same function to create those additional checkboxes at the bottom. And what we're doing is we're just pushing that data into data JSON. And there we go. So we have the ability to add tasks into our array, and we also have that object. So 2 instances, one that's the visible one and one that we're using in the back under data JSON. So next is saving it into the session storage so that we don't lose our data every time we refresh. So that lesson is coming up next.